The art of the CD&A's executive summary, a very important part of the proxy. I'm joined today by Scott Levy, a partner of White and Case in New York, today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. So, Scott, the executive summary, I remember, of course, back in the day, there was no such thing. The proxy was a lot smaller, but now it's really become probably the most important part of the proxy because that's the section that people are most apt to read if it's well done. I guess if it's not well done, then people might not read it and might not read your proxy, which might be your goal, but it is important to have a good executive summary these days. So
Yes,
let's talk about when should you have an executive summary. Maybe it's not appropriate in all cases.
sure. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I don't think it's appropriate in all cases. I don't think it's a required section. It's not even a nice to have. I think there's very specific situations where it makes sense to, think closely about having an executive summary and what role it's actually playing. And when we say executive summary, this could be the summary that's at the beginning of the CD&A, or it could be part of the larger proxy summary at the front of the proxy statement. You'll even see some companies that have a proxy summary that has a short C&DA summary and then yet another executive summary in the CD&A. But let's just talk about the CD&A executive summary, as a concept generally. So I think the first situation is you just feel like the CD&A is becoming too much of a behemoth, and you feel like you need something to frame it. I feel like a lot of companies find themselves in that situation. In that case, you may want to just consider generally streamlining the CD&A generally, but that is an option, right? As a way to frame what has become an overly long CD&A. The second one is if you feel that you need to drive home a consistent message with investors and you're concerned that that message is going to be buried in the abyss of the CD&A. This is, I guess, for companies where the CD&A is no longer just a compliance document. It has become a messaging document for, investors, for analysts, for proxy advisors. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that message often involves tying, financial performance during the year to pay, and defending your pay program. The third situation where you see it a lot is something special happened during the year, and you want to make that the focus of your CD&A, while still meeting all of the different requirements. So there may have been an executive transition. There may have been a big corporate transaction. Maybe there was some issue with severance, or something along those lines. Maybe you had to modify awards. We can talk about situations where you would want to bury some of those things as opposed to highlighting them. But in a lot of cases, those are going to be front and center, and you want people to be focusing on that, as opposed to some of the other noise in the CD&A. The fourth situation is you're concerned that you'll receive a negative recommendation, a negative vote recommendation from a proxy advisor such as ISS or Glass Lewis. And the fifth situation is you've actually received a negative recommendation in the past. You may have, had low support for say on pay in the prior year. Below 70% for ISS purposes, below 80% for Glass Lewis purposes, and you need to show that your compensation committee has been responsive to the concerns of shareholders.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is the proxy's become a messaging document, and this is a way for a company to put its best foot forward when it has messaging that it really wants to get across. This executive summary is a great vehicle and a vehicle that investors have come to expect companies to have if there's something important to say.
Yes.
So this is not, like you said, a required section of the proxy, but what are the basic components that you typically see?
Sure. Sometimes this will take the form of a letter from the compensation committee chairperson. Other times it will be more of a narrative disclosure that looks similar to other sections of the CD&A. Other times it will be more graphically driven. But the basic components will depend on your facts and your audience. But there are a few common threads, that you will tend to see in some of these executive summaries. So I think a discussion of the company's pay for performance philosophy is very common. That's going to be found later in the CD&A. But that is oftentimes the heart of the executive summary is tying pay to performance. So the general philosophy, a couple of sentences on that will be very helpful. We always see a discussion of the components of compensation and what was actually paid. So a breakdown that goes through, base salary, cash incentive awards, long-term incentive awards, anything else that may have been unusual or special. I don't think you need to provide a detailed explanation of what everyone was paid. You can show ranges, right? You can say, are the base salaries for our NEOs range from X to X, right? The incentive cash payouts were X percentage of the target was X percentage of base salary to Y percentage of base salary, and then you can explain how the payouts actually worked out. Some companies will focus more on the CEO here because that is what investors care the most about. I think pay mix, right? How much of the pay is at risk is a very common disclosure to include here. And people have different opinions about what at risk means. And then finally, a discussion of how pay aligned with performance for the year. I think that's always included. Some of the other sections that you may want to include depending on your circumstances. One is financial performance. Obviously, you're going to show how pay actually linked to performance, but you may not want to get too detailed into your financial results. You may want to kind of drive by them. In some cases, it's very much worth highlighting them. If you had a great year, then going through your financial performance in a way that is consistent with your earnings releases throughout the quarters and how you speak to investors generally is going to be very helpful. This is usually to justify higher pay. Sometimes it's the opposite. In some cases, you may want to show that the summary compensation table is not representative of what people were actually paid, and that the company underperformed, and that was matched by a lack of a payout on PSUs or a low bonus payout, right? There's different ways to do that without making the company look bad. So that's the section that's often included, but not always. If you related to that, a lot of companies will include a realizable pay table where they feel that the summary compensation table overstates pay. The SEC does not allow companies to modify the summary compensation table, but it will not object to a supplemental table. So this will, instead of showing the grant date fair value of certain awards, it may show how awards actually paid out. It may, cut out some of the things like, perquisites or some of the, supplemental compensation that doesn't relate to target compensation. And then I think for, the last two components that you sometimes see, but not always, are if a company, did not do well in the prior year on, say, on pay, it received, as you mentioned before, less than 70% for ISS purposes, less than 80% for Glass Lewis purposes. Then a discussion of what the company heard from investors and what the company actually did, a detailed discussion, usually in the format of a chart, on all of the points of all of the complaints, grievances from investors, and then how the company responded, complaint or grievance by complaint. And then another one that is common but not always included is discussion of current year compensation. So the SEC does not require a discussion of current year compensation in the CD&A. Instead, it is obviously the prior year compensation. So if you're publishing a proxy statement in 2025, you would talk about the compensation in fiscal year 2024. But you may want to put a focus on 2025 because maybe 2024 comp, you feel that there's some, uh, concern there that investors may have, but you fixed it right in 2025, or maybe 2025 comp, you want to focus more on it because you had an executive transition, and the executives that you paid in 2024 maybe are not with the company anymore, and the focus is let's look forward and talk about how we're using compensation now, to drive forward, the value of your investment.
Let's talk a minute about the process. Who should be involved in preparing or reviewing the executive summary?
Sure. So I think it depends on the company's size and resources, but we will usually see someone from the internal legal team leading the charge. Whoever is in charge of um, the proxy statement generally is often, taking the laboring oar on the executive summary. So you'll have at least one member from the internal legal team. Um, I've seen companies where the CFO is quite involved as well in drafting the executive summary, but that is, specific to the company's size and how interested the CFO is in, in some of these, generally in compensation. If the discussion of financial performance is very front and center, the CFO will be more involved. Um, Compensation consultants are a critical part of this. If you do have a compensation consultant, um, you know, uh, you should use them to help you draft disclosure. They can often provide very, good comments on how to structure things in terms of should you include graphics, what should you highlight, what's the narrative supposed to be. Maybe they're not going to take the pen, but they oftentimes provide very helpful comments. And it's important for the narrative to actually match up with the advice they're giving you substantively on on how to structure your compensation program. Outside counsel maybe task, sorry, with drafting some portions or drafting the entire thing, depending on the company's resources and situation. um, Investor relations, it's helpful for them to take a quick look just to make sure that the messaging on company performance is consistent with how they're speaking to investors about it. But I would say that they don't need to be front and center in the process. So the compensation committee um, should be brought in at least to read the executive summary, when it is complete, and should be given ample time to comment on it. In some situations, they're brought in much earlier, and I've actually seen, compensation committee chairpersons involved in drafting, in the earlier stages. But you'll see that more in situations where the company had a negative experience with SanPay in the prior year and is working very hard to avoid the same situation in the current year, or understands that the pay versus performance alignment was not great in the prior year, or there were some problematic aspects of the pay program, which, despite being problematic, were necessary, and wants to anticipate potential objections from investors, and the compensation committee will be more involved in that situation.
And I'll tell you who should not be involved in drafting the executive summary is AI, because although
Yeah.
AI is great for summarizing documents, this is a messaging section of the proxy, and AI, no matter how smart AI is not going to know the message that the company wants to convey.
Hmm.
And of course, if it's also the AI model you're using is not sandbox, it's not a closed system, you don't want to share a draft of the proxy in it anyways, because then you're sharing that into the ether. You're training the LLM, the AI, and that's confidential information until you file the proxy, and you don't want it out there.
Exactly. Hmm.
What are tips that you would suggest that can improve on the basics?
Sure. So I think the most important tip, I spoke through a lot of I spoke about the sections of the executive summary, the different components, and I know it sounded like a lot. However, a lot of those, sections are included only in certain situations. But the most important tip is keep it short. This is a summary, and this should not turn into a 5 to 10 page document, that is a document within a document, right? This is probably going to be the only section that a lot of investors will actually read in the CD&A. So if you lose their focus because you've made it too long, then you're fighting the wrong battle. So, I would say, a page to maybe 3 pages is an appropriate length. The second tip would be make sure it's broken up into sections, right? Don't just have one long narrative. Include clear headings, like you would in the rest of the CD&A. Try to keep the paragraphs short. Consider using bullet points. The third tip would be, if you can, opt for graphics as opposed to a narrative disclosure. Unless, of course, you don't want to highlight something and you feel like the graphic is going to bring attention to something that you don't want to. I guess the last tip would be, this is your opportunity to highlight the good, right, and downplay the bad. The CD&A is both a messaging document and a compliance document, and there are certain things that you just cannot avoid disclosing. For example, if you modified awards, during the year, for whatever reason, you can't avoid disclosing those. But so there's going to be some section of the CD&A where they are addressed. But you may want to use the summary as a way to highlight all of the great things that you're doing.
So just like I mentioned, AI is not a good tool to create a summary because the executive summary is not just a summary of the proxy or summary of the CD&A. It's a specific message. I would also think the update of the executive summary from year to year, you're almost starting with a clean page because your story this year is likely different than your story last year. Hopefully it is, but maybe it's not. I guess there are cases where you might look back at last year's executive summary and say, oh, much of this might apply to this year. But in some cases, you might be starting fresh. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's something to be said for, once you have a framework, and you've gotten positive feedback on it from investors, or you haven't received negative feedback on it from investors, I think it will be easier to update, right? So the once you've done an executive summary, maybe once or twice, it will be much more streamlined in terms of doing the executive summary in future years. That said, a pure copy paste and with updating numbers, right, as if this were an MD&A section, right? I know those are obviously still heavily modified, right? But it's not going to look just like that, right? You need to take a step back, and early in the process, ask yourself, what is our audience this year? Is it the same audience as the prior year? And what are we really trying to accomplish with this executive summary? And what happened during the year, that may change how we approach this section. So year to year, the primary audience may change, right? It's always going to be investors, of course, but that they may be more important in one year versus the next year. You're more focused on appeasing proxy advisors, right? And making sure they give you a positive, voting recommendation on SandPay. Maybe you're really concerned about how this is going to be viewed by employees, right? I've worked with clients where they're very concerned. They have a bonus pool that is paid out to many employees, and they're concerned that there was disparate treatment for the executives versus the general employee population, right? And they know that employees are going to go look at the summary compensation table, see the bonus payouts for the executives, and they're probably not going to read that later discussion in the CD&A of how the bonus program works because it's just so complicated, right? They're going to instead go to the executive summary, and they want to be the company wants to be very clear that if there was disparate treatment for the executives, why that is the case, or perhaps to fight that objection to begin with, right? Or something along the lines of, why are the executives receiving more equity than other people, right? It may be analysts, right, that are looking closely at this, right? The analysts, are closely, are more involved for some reason in compensation than they might normally be. and how you discuss financial performance is going to be very important there. So I think that's the first question. And the second question is, what happened during the year, right? And if your financial performance was very strong, then maybe you want to include more discussion around that. Maybe you want to get into some of the substantive highlights, some of the non-financial highlights. If it was not that great, then you don't have to, it's not necessary that you talk about your underperformance unless, of course, that is part of your messaging on why, the pay came out the way it did. And sometimes you'll want to focus more on current year compensation versus prior year compensation. And that has to do with, what did prior compensation actually look like? Who's still at the company from that group of individuals? And is current year compensation maybe being used to remedy some of the issues with prior year compensation? So yeah, I think it's very dependent on audience and what you're trying to accomplish. But I don't think you need to view it as a complete tabula rasa.
Thanks so much, Scott. This is awesome. Now I know everything there is to know about executive summary, and obviously you do too.
Very happy to help. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Brock.